Welcome to Jazz Piano Skills. I'm Dr. Bob Lawrence. It's time to discover, learn, and play jazz piano. How about those Texas Rangers? Can you believe it? I can't believe it. The Texas Rangers are World Series champs. I'm going to say that again. The Texas Rangers are World Series champs. I don't think anyone saw it coming. You know, I got to tell you, I grew up a Chicago Cubs fan. And of course, if you are a Cubby fan, you are used to losing and you're used to disappointment. And when the Cubs won the World Series in 2016, it was a huge shock. However, as much of a shock as it was when my beloved Chicago Cubs were crowned champions, I can honestly say, I think the Rangers winning the World Series is even a bigger shock. I am still in shock, and I'm ecstatic as well. I've been following the Rangers since 1984 when I arrived in the Lone Star State, so I'm thrilled to see how far this franchise has come since the days of Ruben Sierra, Odie McDowell, Larry Parrish, Charlie Huff, Jose Guzman, Jim Sundberg, right? Some of the oldies, right? So congrats to the Texas Rangers. I can't wait to see you repeat in 2024. Okay, enough about baseball and the Rangers. Today, we are going to explore the primary sounds of the note D, applying our jazz improvisation exercises for D major, D dominant, D minor, D half diminished, and D diminished. We have followed the same format since the start of the year, right? Since way back in January. We have been using five specific melodic patterns to focus on developing mobile fingerings that allow our right hand, to be in a constant state of movement. And we all know by now that by constantly moving and positioning our right hand, we establish optimal fingerings needed to produce a solid and authentic jazz articulation. And of course, making sure that we never, ever run out of fingers in the middle of a musical phrase. Now, as I have mentioned, we have utilized this intentional approach for the primary and for the altered sounds since the beginning of the year. And we will continue to do so for the rest of the year, which we're quickly coming to the end, right? So today, we will follow the same format we used in October with the A sounds and apply them to the primary sounds of D. So today, we are going to discover essential jazz improvisation exercises for the primary D sounds. And we are going to learn developmental arpeggio and scale patterns of the D sounds. And we are going to play 5 arpeggio, 5 scale patterns, focusing on fingerings and articulation for the primary D sounds of music. D major, D dominant, D minor, D half diminished, and D diminished. So as I always like to say, regardless of where you are in your jazz journey, a beginner, an intermediate player, an advanced player, or even if you consider yourself a seasoned and experienced professional, you're going to find this Jazz Piano Skills podcast lesson exploring jazz improvisation exercises for the primary D sounds to be very beneficial. But before we dig in, before we get started, I want to take a few minutes, as I do at the beginning of every Jazz Piano Skills podcast episode, to welcome new listeners. And if you are indeed new to Jazz Piano Skills, if you're a new listener to the Jazz Piano Skills podcast, welcome. I want to invite you to become a Jazz Piano Skills member. There's several benefits to becoming a member of Jazz Piano Skills. For one, you will have access to all of the educational podcast packets. These are the illustrations, the lead sheets, the play-along files that I produce to go along with every weekly podcast episode. You will also have access to a sequential online jazz piano curriculum, which is loaded with comprehensive courses. You will also have access to an online weekly masterclass, online interactive fakebook, and of course, an online private jazz piano skills community, which hosts a variety of engaging forums. All of that plus unlimited private, personal, and professional educational support. All of these perks, all of these benefits are waiting for you, wanting to help you discover, learn, and play jazz piano. So when you have a moment, visit jazzpianoskills.com, check it out, and of course, become a member. Once you get there, if you have any questions about any of the educational perks or about the benefits of becoming a Jazz Piano Skills member, by all means, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to spend some time with you, answer any questions that you may have, and of course, help you in any way that I can. Okay, on to the question of the week. This week's question comes from Randy Peterson, who lives in Bettendorf, Iowa. And Randy asks, I am curious about the best way to begin learning and practicing the locked hand style I hear George Shearing playing. I love the sound, but I have to admit I am somewhat confused and intimidated with regard to how best begin learning this style. Thanks for any direction you can provide. Well, Randy, I'm a huge lover of George Shearing and that sound, the locked hands as well. In fact, I dedicated several podcast episodes to locked hands back in September, October of 2021. So if you haven't checked out those podcast episodes, I would highly recommend doing so. There's an episode dedicated to each of the primary sounds, major, dominant, minor, half, diminished, and diminished, that are pretty thorough. So be sure to check those episodes out. But let me take a few minutes right now to give you some quick pointers, some ideas on how I recommend starting the process of getting familiar with and learning locked hands. To begin, locked hands, for those of you who may not be familiar with this style of playing, is where the melody of a tune or improvisation is doubled an octave apart and split between both hands. Typically, the melody is played with the little finger in your right hand and your thumb an octave lower in your left hand. The rest of the sound is played within the octave that you've created with both hands using the remaining fingers of your right hand. So, for example, the C minor sound with the note C functioning as the melody is played like this. I have my little finger with C, an octave above middle C, with my little finger in my right hand. In my left hand, I have middle C with my thumb. So I've created an octave using both of my hands. Now I'm going to actually insert the third, the fifth, and the seventh of the C minor with the remaining fingers in my right hand. So now I get this. So that's the C minor sound played locked hands with the melody note being the note C. That's it, right? The concept is pretty simple. The melody is played in octaves with the rest of the sound squished in between the octaves, right? A little side note, Glenn Miller used to voice his saxophone section using this approach. So no doubt it's been around for quite a while, right? So now that you know how to create the locked hand sound I would recommend doing so starting with the 4 primary notes of the sound: the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. So once again, using C minor, the C minor sound as our model, practice ascending and descending through the sound, root, third, fifth, and seventh, using locked hands. In other words, play an arpeggio. This step is so important that I would not even begin worrying about the next step until you can do this for all 12 major chords, all 12 dominant chords, all 12 minor chords, 12 half diminished chords, and diminished chords. Right? Let me say it again. I wouldn't even worry about the next step until you can play locked hands, root, third, fifth, and seventh, the arpeggio, using the locked hand style. So it will sound like this: C minor. I'm just going straight up, root, third, 5, 7, coming right back down, 7, 5, third, root. I'm doubling that melody in an octave and playing the remaining of the rest of the minor sound within the octave. Okay? Again, step number 1. And once you can create and play the locked hand style for all 12 major, 12 dominant, 12 minor, 12 half diminished, and 12 diminished chords, you can then begin to turn your attention to the 3 remaining scale tones. Again, using C minor as our model, we have the notes D, F, and A to learn using the locked hands approach. Now, the best and most efficient way to begin thinking about adding the second, fourth, and sixth to your root, third, fifth, and seventh to create the entire scale using a locked hands approach is to pair your root with the second, your third with the fourth, the fifth with the sixth, and the seventh with the root. So we end up with something like this: your root with your second. So I'm doing that. The guts, the inner workings of my sound remain the same. I'm just changing the octave from C to D. Okay. Now I go to my third, and I'm going to pair it with my fourth. Again, the inside of my minor sound remains the same. The octave is the only thing changing. The E flat up to the F. Then my fifth with my sixth, my G with my A. And again, the inside of my minor sound remains the same. In my hand, I'm just changing the octave. Right, and now I can play my seventh. And I like to pair it with the root. So I have these groupings: root and second, third and fourth, fifth and sixth, seventh and octave. Now I can begin, once I have those pairs worked out, now I can begin practicing the entire scale using a locked hands approach. And it will sound like this. Let me do that again. Now, I wouldn't even think about how to approach playing the remaining 5 non-scale tones or tension tones until I can play all 12 major scales, 12 dominant scales, 12 minor scales, 12 half diminished scales, and 12 diminished scales using the locked hand style. Wow. So once you can do that, Randy, shoot me another question about adding the non-scale tones, and I will address it at that time. Until then, you have your hands full thinking through, formulating, and practicing the locked hands approach. And again, I would recommend going back to the September and October of 2021 to check out my podcast episodes dedicated to locked hands. Nevertheless, I hope this helps you get started with learning locked hands. It's a great question, Randy, and as always, let me know if you have any additional questions or would like further clarification. Okay, onward with our exploration of jazz improvisation exercises for the primary D sounds. Okay, poor fingerings, without question, and again, based on decades of teaching experience, is the number one reason why people have difficulty playing the piano. No doubt about it. Quite simply, it's a lack of finger mobility, a type of hand paralysis that makes it difficult for students to generate melodic lines, whether those lines are read or whether those lines are improvised, right? Now, scale and arpeggio practice is, of course, a great way to begin developing hand mobility. However, melodies, whether they're, again, written or improvised, do not just simply ascend and descend in straight lines. Therefore, it's important to begin practicing melodic patterns, like the ones that we have been exploring since the start of the year, that challenge us to begin shifting our hands across the keys, right? In other words, practicing intentional shifting, which begins to simulate a musical reality that pianists must address. And this musical reality, the need to always have fingers available, allowing us to move in either direction, up or down, right? And this must be practiced in such a way that it develops proper musical instincts and muscle memory. Musical instincts, muscle memory that allows us to properly articulate melodies so that they sound idiomatic to jazz, so that they sound like jazz. And this is precisely why the melodic patterns that we are exploring today focus on intentionally creating hand shifts within a melodic line, even if it is possible to play the melodic line with no hand shift at all, right? The objective is to begin establishing and developing hand-finger mobility. And in fact, some of the fingerings I have notated in the lead sheets intentionally include multiple hand shifts within a single measure of music, within one melodic idea. So throughout this year, we have been devoting our effort to exploring the 5 primary sounds of music for all 12 notes using arpeggio and scale developmental improvisational exercises that will force us to deal with fingerings and force us to develop hand mobility. We are utilizing the same approach to explore the altered sounds of music, right? The flat 9, sharp 9, sharp 11, flat 5, sharp 5, flat 13 as well. Now, each month, we focus on one of the 12 notes, 1 week of the month devoted to the primary sounds like today, and 1 week devoted to the altered sounds like next week. We then follow it up, as always, with a bebop tune to help us apply our new fingerings and articulation to a musical setting. So the educational agenda for today is as follows. Number 1, we begin our jazz improvisation exercises for the primary D sounds. Number 2, we will play essential arpeggio patterns that you need to discover, learn, and play from the root of the sound to the 13th of the sound. and using various entry points, the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. Number 3, we will play essential scale patterns that you need to discover, learn, and play. Again, from the root to the 13th of the sound, using various entry points, the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. And number 4, I will be playing all the jazz improvisation exercises today using the pure dominant sound. And number 5, I will be playing all jazz improvisation exercises today using our traditional swing groove with a tempo of 110. Now, if you are a Jazz Piano Skills member, I want you to take a few minutes right now to download and print your podcast packets, the illustrations, the lead sheets, and the play-alongs. Again, your membership grants you access to all of the educational podcast packets for every weekly podcast episode. And as I mentioned, every week you should be using these podcast packets when listening to this episode to get the most out of it. And of course, you should be using these podcast packets when practicing as well. Now, if you are listening to this podcast on any of the popular podcast directories, such as Apple, Google, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, and so on, then be sure to go directly to jazzpianoskillspodcast.com. That's jazzpianoskillspodcast.com to download your podcast packets. And you will find the active download links within the show notes. Okay, one final but very significant, very important message. If you are listening and you are thinking at this very moment that the jazz improvisation exercises for the primary D sounds and the various skills that we are about to discover, learn, and play are over your head, then I would say to you, please, no worries. Breathe in, breathe out, relax. Continue to listen, continue to grow your jazz piano skills intellectually by doing just that, by just simply listening. Every new skill, I say it every week, every new skill is technically over our heads when first introduced, but this is how we get better. We do not run away from conversations where we are hearing things that we've never heard before, right? That we're forced to grow intellectually. Right? I say it all the time. All musical growth begins upstairs mentally, conceptually, before it can come out downstairs physically in your hands. So sit back, listen to this podcast lesson now to discover and learn. The play, as it always does, will come in time. I guarantee it. Okay, now that you have your lead sheets in your hands, I want to point out a few things. You will see that lead sheets 1 through 5 deal with arpeggio motion. Lead sheets 6 through 10 deal with scale motion. You will also notice that the jazz improvisation exercises are the same for all 5 primary sounds: major, dominant, minor, half diminished, and diminished. The exercises are, of course, modified to reflect the proper sound, to reflect the proper chord scale relationship. Now, you will also notice that my suggested fingerings are included for every note of every exercise for every sound. Now, of course, you can modify the fingerings slightly, but as always, be very careful. Remember, the fingerings are what allow you to play with proper jazz articulation. So you may be inclined to change the fingerings because you think it feels more comfortable or is easier. However, your easier may end up making it harder for you to play in the long run and to play with a proper jazz articulation. And by all means, do not alter fingerings to remove the hand shifting that is built into the fingerings. That's the entire objective of the entire podcast lesson of all of these exercises for each of the primary sounds. These intentional hand shifts are built in to help develop hand and finger mobility. Okay, so let's dig in. I want you to grab lead sheet 2, and I want you to grab lead sheet 7. Pull them out of your podcast packet. Lead sheet 2, lead sheet 7. Skill 2, skill 7. You'll see that skill 2 deals with arpeggio motion for the dominant sound, the D dominant sound. And lead sheet 7, skill 7, deals with scale motion for the D dominant sound. We are going to begin with lead sheet 2, skill 2. So you'll see we have 5 patterns. These are the 5 patterns we've been dealing with all year, laid out for you. Letter A, B, C, D, and E. Letter A begins with just simple 4-note ascending arpeggio from the root, from the 3rd, from the 5th, and from the 7th. From the root, our 4-note arpeggio takes us to the 7th. From the 3rd, we travel to the 9th. From the 5th, we ascend to the 11th. And from the 7th, our destination is the 13th. Very straightforward. 4 fragments of the D dominant sound, 4 entry points, root, 3rd, 5, and 7. Simple 4-note ascending arpeggio, but look at the fingerings. Each one of those 4-note arpeggios has a hand shift built in. And you can see the primary fingerings are 1, 3, 1, 3, and 2, 1, 2, 4. Very interesting, right? So I want to bring the ensemble in. I'm going to play letter A. Start off, I'll play the D7 sound up front for about 4 measures. I will play each fragment 4 times before moving on to the next fragment. Okay? 4 times. So let's bring the ensemble in and let's check out letter A. Tempo is 110, swing groove. Here we go. Very nice, right? 4-note arpeggios, each arpeggio with an intentional hand shift. I cannot stress enough how important letter A is for getting used to hand mobility and hand shifting, playing with the proper articulation, simple 4-note ascending arpeggio through the D7 sound. Now, letter B, we stick with the same idea, except we add a little contour to our arpeggio. So instead of a straight arpeggio going up D7, we now have a little contour built in. Right? Again, our entry points remain the same. Root, 3rd, 5, and 7. We're exploring the entire sound from the root to the 13th. Our fingerings, check them out carefully. There are hand shifts built into each one of these motifs. Do not eliminate those hand shifts if you make any adjustments to the fingerings. We want those hand shifts in there, okay? Again, swing groove. Again, tempo of 110. So let's bring the ensemble in and let's listen to letter B. Here we go. Love it. Very nice. Now, again, I'm playing everything at a tempo of 110 today. By all means, I mention this quite often in these podcast episodes. Play at slower tempos as you're getting used to these patterns, as you're getting used to the fingerings and the hand shifts. Not a problem playing at 60, 70, 80. Always play at a tempo that allows you to succeed. Then once you have the pattern and the fingerings well under control, then you can begin exploring various tempos and even various grooves for that matter, right? But keep things very relaxed and very comfortable as you're digesting these new patterns, these new skills, these new fingerings. Okay, so let's take a look at letter C. Now, I love letter C because the hand shifts are really, really obvious, right? Like look at the fingering for the very first motif. 1-4, 1-4, 2-1, right? So you have our hand is shifting. We're getting a thumb up on an F sharp on a black note. I absolutely love it, right? Quite often we're told to avoid doing that. Not the case. Not the case at all, especially when it comes to playing jazz. So I want to bring the ensemble in. Again, we're going to play at a tempo of 110, swing groove. Same four entry points as always, root, third, 5, and 7. We have our hand shifts built into these patterns, so pay attention to those. Mark those if you need to. And let's check it out. Here we go. So letter D, as we all know, if you've been doing the program since the beginning of the year with all these exercises, all these patterns, letter D always deals with the eighth note triplet rhythmic pattern. So we have our eighth note triplets that we are playing here. Really great little idea. Again, same 4 entry points, root third, 5, and 7. A lot of hand shifting going on with these triplets, so be very, very careful. Triplets are tricky, so again, much slower tempos if need be to get the feel, to get the fingerings, to get the articulation correct before you start playing at faster tempos. So let's bring the ensemble in. I'll play D7 up front for about 4 measures to get into the feel, and then I will play each motif, each melodic idea 4 times before moving on to the next one. So here we go. Letter D, eighth note triplets. Here we go. We're down to our very last pattern exercise today for arpeggio motion, exploring the D7 sound using arpeggio motion. Our melodic line now has gotten stretched beyond a measure. We're into the second measure, so we're crossing over the bar line, which is great. We're back to eighth notes, no triplets. Thank heaven, right? So our entry points, as always, remain the same, the root third, 5, and 7. Again, we have quite a bit of hand shifting taking place in this motif. So be very, very careful. So let's bring the ensemble in. Let's have a little fun with letter E. Here we go. All right, so that does it for arpeggio motion, exploring the D7 sound using arpeggio motion. Now, Again, I'm just modeling it today for D7. You need to utilize your podcast packet, explore these same arpeggio patterns for the D major sound, D minor, D half diminished, and D diminished as well. They're in your podcast packets. The fingerings are notated for every note, for each of the patterns, for each of those sounds. So you got a little work to do, right? So now let's move on to Skills 7, Lead Sheet 7. Still exploring the D7 sound, but now our attention shifts to scale movement, scale motion, as opposed to arpeggio motion. And you'll see letter A, we have straight ascending scale movement. Again, same 4 entry points, root, 3rd, 5, and 7. Each entry point, the root travels to the 7th, the 3rd to the 9th, the 5th to the 11th, and the 7th to the 13th. And we have hand shifts taking place, of course, traditional hand shifts actually taking place with this scale motion, this scale movement. So let's bring the ensemble in. Again, I'm going to play D7 up front for 4 measures. Then I'll play each scale, the dominant scale from each entry point 4 times. So here we go. Let's check it out. Just as I stressed with letter A with regards to arpeggio motion, I want to stress it here, letter A with scale movement. Cannot stress it enough how important it is to practice letter A, simple scale movement, ascending, various entry points, playing with great finger, hand shifting, hand movement with the proper fingerings, the proper articulation. Cannot stress it enough. Okay, so letter B, just as we did with the arpeggio, we now add a little contour to the motif or to the scale. So instead of straight scale, all right, we're going to get a little contour to our line. Just a little bit, right? What a difference that makes. So again, mark those hand shifts, the fingerings, if need be. Again, same 4 entry points, root, 3rd, 5, and 7, tempo 110, swing groove. Here we go. Letter B, scale movement for D7. as we did, we had to deal with the eighth note triplet with our arpeggio movement, have to deal with the eighth note triplet with our scale movement. And you look at letter C, it can look visually a little scary, and I guess it is, right? We have eighth note triplets back to back to back to back, right? So again, slow tempos with these eighth note triplets, get the fingerings under control, get a nice articulation at a nice tempo that allows you to succeed before you start increasing the tempo. Okay, so if 110 is too fast, not a problem, slow it down. So here we go. Letter C, same entry points, root third 5/7, the D7 sound using triplet movement through the scale. Here we go. Check it out. Not easy, right? Not easy at all. Whether you're playing the eighth note triplet using arpeggio motion or eighth note triplets using scale motion makes no difference. It's a tough little pattern to rhythmic motif to play, to pull it off, to make it sound correct, not rush it, not to get out in front of the beat when playing triplets, which is easy to do. So if it's challenging to you, just know you're not alone. It's very common, very common. So, all right, letter D. Our musical line gets longer. It goes across the bar line. We have back to eighth notes, no eighth note triplets, right? Back to eighth notes, a lot of hand shifting taking place. But as always, we find comfort in knowing that we're dealing with the same entry points. With the root third, fifth, and seventh. So let's bring the ensemble in and let's check out scale movement, letter D, D7. Here we go. we are down to our very last pattern for today. Letter E, scale 7, dominant, D dominant sound. Again, ascending movement through the scale, the D dominant scale, moving past or over through the bar line into measure 2. So we have quite a bit of fingering going on here. It's all marked. Not a bad idea. Take a little yellow highlighter and mark where those shifts are taking place. One thing I will say real quick, when I'm talking about hand shifting, I mean literally hand shifting. We're not doing, quite often we talk about, or you'll hear teachers talk about thumb under. I'm not talking, when our hand shifts, I'm not talking about thumb under. Because when you do thumb under, what happens is elbow goes out, shoulder goes up. It's inevitable. Thumb under, elbows out, shoulder up. So when I talk about hand shifts, I'm literally talking about the hand shifting, moving across the keys, not this thumb under stuff that you hear teachers say all the time. Okay? So, letter E, same 4 entry points. We do that intentionally. Keep that consistent. Root, third, 5, and 7. We have nice ascending scale movement, lots of hand shifting taking place. Be aware of that. Tempo of 110. Here we go. Check it out. Well, as always, we've done it again, right? Unpacked an enormous amount of information in one very short, one very fast hour. Now, even though I played the jazz improvisation exercises today using the dominant sound only, be sure to practice the exercises, of course, for your major, for your minor, half diminished, and diminished sounds as well. Again, they are all laid out for you in your Lead Sheets podcast packet, fingerings included, right? Now remember, you can make some modifications to those fingerings, right? But do not eliminate the hand shifts. Those fingerings are in there intentionally, right? They're in there to help us develop the right kind of muscle memory that's going to allow us to play with an authentic jazz articulation through the entire sound, through the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh entry that gets us all the way to the 13th of the sound, right? And remember, the articulation of each musical phrase, regardless of the entry point, should sound the same. So you have a ton to tackle this week. So use your practice time wisely. Next week, of course, we jump into jazz improvisation exercises for the D altered sounds, right? As always, I want to encourage you all to use your podcast packets. If you're a Jazz Piano Skills member, get those podcast packets downloaded and printed out. The illustrations, the lead sheets, and the play-alongs. They're there to guide you as you study and practice. And these are educational tools that will help you gain a mastery of the jazz piano skills conceptually, physically, and of course, musically. As always be patient. Developing mature, professional jazz piano skills takes time. It takes a lifetime. So begin structuring your improvisational development after the playing demonstrations that I modeled for you today in this podcast episode, right? And I guarantee it, you will begin to see, feel, and hear your progress. Well, I hope you have found this Jazz Piano Skills podcast lesson exploring jazz improvisation exercises for the primary D sounds to be insightful and, of course, to be beneficial. Don't forget, if you are a Jazz Piano Skills member, I will see you online Thursday evening at the Jazz Piano Skills Masterclass. That's going to be 8 p.m. Central Time to discuss this podcast episode lesson exploring jazz improvisation exercises for the primary D sounds in greater detail, and of course to answer any questions that you may have about the study of jazz in general. If you're unable to make the class Thursday evening, you'll be able to catch a recording of it, view a recording of it through your Jazz Piano Skills account and membership account. You can reach me if you have any questions whatsoever. My number here at the Dallas School of Music is 972-380-8050. My extension is 211. If you prefer email, you can reach me, Dr. Lawrence, Dr. Lawrence at jazzpianoskills.com. Or you can use the nifty little SpeakPipe widget that is found throughout the entire Jazz Piano Skills website. Well, there is my cue. That's it for now. And until next week, enjoy the jazz improvisation exercises for the primary D sounds. And most of all, have fun as you discover, learn, and play jazz piano.